thank you for doing this. And just for you guys, Simon is a member of the Meat Art community, but when I started talking to him, he just had some very interesting stuff that I thought would make a good podcast. And part of that was he worked in, well, I don't know if we want to mention the company or not, but he worked in a major drug developer in helping develop a drug. I think it was the SGLT2 inhibitor, which is being widely used for diabetes right now. And this mechanism of action is it blocks that SGLT, so glucose transporter in the kidney that prevents reabsorption of glucose. And I think it's responsible for something like 90% of all of our reabsorbed glucose. And so you basically just pee off all the glucose that you make. Therefore, you tend to often lose weight and your blood glucose gets lower. So win-win for everybody, but maybe not. We'll get into this. So Simon, without further me blathering on, will you tell us a little bit about your background in more detail? I know you guys are out in the Middle East somewhere, you and your wife. And so if you don't mind going through that, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, hi all. Great to be here, and I've been with the community now for about a month, and thanks for the opportunity to talk. Really enjoyed, by the way, Shawn, really enjoyed the community. The people around are really supportive, and I've learned so much. These podcasts you hold are really interesting, where we've learned about the real salt, red real salt. That was really interesting, and all sorts of stuff. So thank you. I'll tell you what I'm going to do is I thought I'll just tell you a bit about myself and sort of the journey through my science and maybe some of the little conflicts. And I know some of the conflicts would reverberate with you, Shawn, being an orthopedic surgeon and using a hammer and a saw to try and fix people's joints. And now you're trying to fix people's joints with diet. And I think I'm something like that as a conflict as well, where I've been trying to use pharmaceutical or invent new drugs to pharmaceutically sort of manipulate people's metabolism, and where indeed maybe it's all it is a diet change can do the trick, but that's something we can discuss. I'm originally, you can tell by my accent, I'm originally from Australia. I was brought up in Melbourne. I went, first degree was all good Australians should always do their first degree in agricultural science. So I learned how to be a farmer, basically. And then I moved into, did a PhD in physiology and endocrinology, specialising in the brain-gut axis, particularly modulating a hormone called somatostatin. Somatostatin is an interesting hormone. It plays a key role, and any doctor would know about it, is that they use an analogue to somatostatin for the treatment of acromegaly. So people with tumours on the brain which have excessive amounts of growth hormone, they could have very large, long bones and grow excessively. So the very tallest people you would see in the Guinness Book of Records would have excessive amounts of growth hormone. And the way to treat it is use an analogue to somatostatin, which inhibits the production of growth hormone in the hypothalamus. So what I was doing was producing an antibody to somatostatin, so basically looking at blocking the production of somatostatin in an attempt to increase growth hormone levels. And the thing about growth hormone is that it pulsatiles. So by inhibiting somatostatin, you don't actually necessarily increase the overall concentration of growth hormone, but you find out other interesting things about how the hypothalamus and the brain-gut axis works. And indeed, there's many, many hormones, and this brain-gut axis is key for everything that we do with regards to food intake, reproduction, the whole lot. So whatever goes in your stomach talks directly to your brain via the vagus nerves, and also all the many hormones within the gut. For example, somatostatin itself is found within the stomach and inhibits the production of gastrin and involved in the regulation of gastric acid. Furthermore, it's also found within the islets in the pancreas and modulates in concert with glucagon and insulin, and also a hormone called ghrelin. And ghrelin is directly influenced on the growth hormone axis as well. So they play a huge role. So you can see how the interplay between the hypothalamus, the center of the brain that regulates food intake and our emotions, etc., talking directly to our stomachs, and involved in day-to-day stomach function. So there's so many hormones. In fact, you can rattle them all off. Cystokinin, CCK, neuropeptide Y, peptide P. There's so many hormones that play both a role within the gut as well as within the brain. So after my experience as a PhD on regulating somatostatin, I moved on to did a postdoc in Cambridge in the UK, looking at insulin-like growth factor. So another key hormone involved in muscle metabolism and also development of long bones, but also key in many of the glucohomeostasis. So it's not just insulin, but insulin-like growth factor and many binding proteins are involved in the regulation of that hormone. Many weightlifters or bodybuilders abuse insulin-like growth factor as well as growth hormone. And so it's a key trophic factor in muscle metabolism. I got sick of writing grants, being a postdoc, so I decided to go to the dark side, and I started my journey in the pharmaceutical industry working for Pfizer. And that's where I moved to a place called Sandwich down in the UK. And Sandwich was actually one of the most productive sites in the whole world with regards to drug discovery. A lot of great medicines came out of Sandwich in the UK. Navarok, which is a HIV antifungal drug, antiviral drug, came from Sandwich. Diflucan, antifungal drug. Amlodipine, calcium blocker channel for blood pressure, came out of Pfizer. The alpha adrenal receptor Carnivore for benign prostate hyperplasia came out of Sandwich and Pfizer, and everyone will know sildenafil. So Viagra came out of Sandwich in Pfizer. So when I joined Sandwich, the alpha adrenal receptor blocker hit the market. Viagra was about 2 years off from hitting the market, so it was a real hub of drug discovery and excitement at the time. I worked on a little bit of Viagra for a while, looking at secondary additional indications. We even tested Viagra in looking at patients with preeclampsia in an attempt to increase blood flow to the uterus with patients with pregnancy-induced preeclampsia in an attempt to increase blood flow to the developing uterus. So that was a real brave step by a company like Pfizer to actually test Viagra in pregnant women. We did that work, and it was exciting times. And then the drug that came out of my lab, we set up I can't remember, about 15 years ago now, we set up a group, a department looking at trying to identify new medicines for the treatment of obesity. And out of that program came Steletro, I think they call it now, which is an SGLT2 inhibitor. And I'll talk a little bit about that later and how it works and some interesting physiology from it and how there's a shift in some patients, there's a shift in production of ketones in an attempt to maintain their metabolism. For those people, and I think it's really interesting to talk about drug discovery, and I like to educate a little bit about drug discovery. And it's the reason I say it's interesting because the way COVID vaccine is being developed at the moment, it's being developed in a rapid pace. So I worked at Pfizer for about 17 years. And I was a drug discoverer, I would call myself. So I'm the one who sits in the lab or gets people to work for me, inventing new drugs. So that I'm a preclinical scientist. And I would follow that molecule through into the clinic, into a phase 2 setting. So it takes about 15 years for a drug to come from idea to the market, and it costs about $1 billion to do that. And then the patent life of the drug through is about 25 years. So this is why it costs so much for a new drug when it hits the market, because the pharmaceutical companies need to recoup their investment within the first few years. So they need to make billions of dollars just to break even on that drug in that time frame. So that's why the marketing cost is often greater than the R&D costs. And it takes about 5 to 7 years for the preclinical work. So you've got to do all the safety studies in preclinical species, and then you get to the stage where you can start testing your molecule in the phase 1. So that's generally healthy volunteers, and you're looking at how the drug interacts with the human body. Is it safe? And that's the key, safety studies in humans. Generally, you'll test healthy volunteers aged between 18 and say less than 60 with no health issues, because you want to understand just if the molecule is safe in those patients. And that study that drug would be tested in about 30 patients, or maybe 50 patients. Following that, you move the molecule if it's safe. And it behaves itself in the manner that you expected. For example, it lasts 12 hours, or in a case of an antibody, it lasts 21 days or 42 days. You move that molecule into phase 2, where you start to test the molecule in hundreds of patients, trying to identify the correct dose that's efficacious and does what you think it would do. Then if it does what you think it do, you move into phase 3, and then we're looking at thousands of patients now, which is relatively small. And if you look at the indication that I'm currently working on, I'm working on osteoarthritis, where approximately some 20% of people over the age of 45 have some form of osteoarthritis. Our phase 3 studies will be done in 3,000, 4,000 people before it will get to market. And then after that 15 years from idea to approval, the drug will be on the market. Following, so that's the pharmaceutical industry. When I first joined Pfizer, I was looking at immunomanipulation. So I would produce an antibody, and I would try to manipulate certain hormones. And at the time when I joined Pfizer, not only was Viagra getting excited, but there was a really interesting hormone called myostatin, was just published in a Nature paper. And the role of myostatin was identified from a mutation, a genetic mutation in a breed of cattle called Belgian Blues. And if anyone's got their website open, look up what a Belgian Blue looks like. It's a double-muscled cow. They have extensive muscle, over-muscled cow. They're found in Belgium. They're used in the production of meat. These animals are so big that they generally need to have a cesarean in order for calving to be successful. But what happened is that the scientists in this Nature paper discovered a hormone called myostatin, and myostatin has a negative feedback on muscle growth. So if you don't have myostatin, or you don't have the receptor for myostatin, you have excessive doubling muscle of the animals. And indeed, we demonstrated this in preclinical rodent models, that if you block myostatin with an antibody, the animals would start to produce not necessarily what you see in the Belgian Blue, but they'll have excessive growth in their muscles. They have a reduction in fat content because the muscles are hypertrophied, and they're starting to have an increased metabolism. So we moved that molecule into the clinic, did phase 1 studies, and we started looking at for the treatment of frailty in elderly, as well as the potential for a myostatin antagonist for muscular dystrophy. People with muscular dystrophy haven't got any strength in muscle, have very poor muscle tone. So there's an opportunity to develop a molecule that could increase muscle growth in these patients. So at the time we were quite excited, and as the molecule moved into phase 2, we started to look at muscle hypertrophy in response to a myostatin antagonist. And at the time, Pfizer weren't the only pharmaceutical company that were looking at myostatin inhibitors. I think Novartis at the time were also looking at myostatin inhibitors. And indeed, this class of molecule failed. And it's an interesting story. When you block myostatin in humans, you do indeed get an increase in muscle growth. And the way they measured muscle growth is they took frail patients, I think they were greater than 50 years of age, and they looked at the circumference of the thigh, and you got a significant increase in muscle growth of the thigh. However, the patients weren't any stronger. They weren't able to walk any further than they had previously prior to receiving treatment. So what happened with the myostatins story is that although they had an increased growth, their strength wasn't any better. And the reason being is that the hypertrophy caused by myostatin antibodies or inhibitors didn't stimulate the nerves binding to the muscles at the neurojunctions. So you didn't actually get strength caused by neuromuscular junction and nerve stimulation. So although they had muscle growth, they didn't have the equipment in order to facilitate strength. And indeed, in hindsight, it's a marvellous thing. If you look at the Belgian Blues, they're not very strong. They're not used at all for pulling carts or any heavy work. They're just used for meat production and meat production only.
That's pretty fascinating. I was going to say they're all show and no go.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. I don't know if that happens with bodybuilders either. I'm not sure. After that, I worked in urology for a while, but then we started up the obesity department, which is a really interesting area to work in, and it was quite brave of Pfizer at the time, because why would you set up an obesity department when the FDA don't see there's no regulatory endpoint for obesity. You've got to work in a cardiovascular or metabolic disease area. So you're looking at blood pressure, cardiovascular events, or diabetes. So at the time, I think we and probably some other pharmaceutical companies were at the forefront trying to guide the FDA, saying that obesity is actually a syndrome. It's a complexity of many things. Syndrome X is basically what it is. And if we developed a molecule that treated Syndrome X, would you give it regulatory approval to be marketed? And I never was at Pfizer long enough to get an answer to that. But we set up the department and we tried our best. So the questions I originally asked myself when I was in the department and running a group was, what is actually obesity? Is it a disease? And that's a big question. Is it actually a disease? And I believe it is. It's a disease of the brain and disease of metabolic ill health, regulated by hundreds of different hormones and how they interact with the brain and gut. And then the second question, how would you treat obesity with a single molecule? And the reason being why I say a single molecule is that in order to get a drug to market, you would never have a multiple molecule within one pill. The cost of doing that is outrageous. So you're just multiplying your costs. I said it costs about $1 billion to get a drug to market. You're just multiplying that out by 3 or 4 times if you've got multiple mechanisms within that one pill. And then secondly, the interactions between different mechanisms is provides significant risk with regards to safety. And that's the key concern as you're developing a new molecule. First, you've got to be thinking of safety, and then efficacy. And you want profound efficacy because you'll dilute the effect over time. So when we set up this group, the key things is that probably you want to regulate food intake is the number one thing if you're going to set up a department in obesity, and what actually regulates food intake. The other aspects of obesity you probably want to regulate would be increased metabolic rate, maybe increased muscle. But food intake was one of our first things we started looking at in a fair bit of detail. And as I've already mentioned, there's a plethora of different hormones that regulate food intake. CCK, which is a hormone originally found to be critical in the contraction of the gallbladder. So once fat hits the small intestine, you get CCK released, and that CCK triggers goes to the brain basically indirectly via nerves, and tells the gut, tells the brain to suppress food intake. So that's probably why, and I've been doing a number of experiments on myself, being carnivore for the last 45 days. And one thing that I have really noticed is that when you have a high-fat diet, the satiety mechanism kicks in really, really quick. Like I don't want to eat anymore. I was really enjoying that food. That's it, bang, that's no more. In fact, I'm probably overwhelmed, and you can almost feel the fat or something's happening, running through your brain, saying, okay, that's it, I don't want any more. In fact, I'm almost nauseous now, whereas like a minute before, you were really, really enjoying the meal. And I think that high fat is really driving some of these neurohormones straight from the gut to the brain, which you wouldn't get that sort of trigger with regards to carbohydrate, protein, fat. And I think that's a key thing with regards to that standard American diet sort of scenario. It's the combination of those three macronutrients that are tricking the body to some extent with regards to how much you can eat at a given time. So scaling back the diet to just eating meat has really started to test me with regards to to understand what actually is going with some of these gut hormones. But there's so many different gut hormones, including dopamine and insulin, that are involved in the regulation of food intake. And indeed, when we started looking at how can you manipulate food intake, we started to pick on the brain with regards to satiety mechanisms. So the most interesting, and I think the most interesting, is reward pathways, and how reward pathways regulate food intake. And the classical reward pathways, dopamine and serotonin. And indeed, many antidepressants, antidepressant drugs, cause significant weight gain and significant increases in food intake. So that's highlighting that reward pathway is involved in food intake. And then indeed, if we could manipulate the serotonin dopamine pathway in a more beneficial way, you could actually suppress food intake. However, you don't want to really be doing that, mucking around with the brain. And indeed, we see that in some preclinical work in rats, where you feed them a standard American diet and have excessive amounts of fructose available in their drinking water. I think we were adding about 20 to 30% fructose in their drinking water. Basically, you can see the brain light up like they were on cocaine. The amount of serotonin and dopamine that was being flooding the brain in response to just diet was incredible. And indeed, in some papers, you can see that it's equivalent to morphine or a dopamine hit. These animals, of course, they become excessively overweight over time. They die earlier on due to a number of different reasons, most likely cancers and metabolic reasons. But the other aspect of the food intake is, and I'm still trying to question what the carnivore diet is doing to me, is with regards to this theory on body weight called the set point. It's thought that the human body sits at a set point, and this is highlighted in The Biggest Loser, where people lose weight quickly. They go into a starvation mode. Their hunger increases, their metabolism drops, and their set point changes. They almost go into like a hibernating bear scenario. And then when they start to eat properly, their hunger still increases, and then they'll start putting more weight on, trying to reach their starting point, their original set point, and then they'll go over the top of their set point, and they'll have a new set point. And again, I think that's what's happened in those people that are on the Biggest Loser, where the hunger and metabolism are counterbalancing. So if you could modulate the set point, that could be an interesting way to manipulate someone by pharmaceutical means. However, I think the plethora of different hormones and scenarios and environmental influences are going to be almost impossible to pharmaceutically modulate a set point. However, I think the carnivore diet modulates a set point. I'm not sure how. I think by eating, again, protein and fat, that set point shifts down to a point where the metabolism's increased and the hunger is balanced. And you'll start to meet a set point that is suited for your particular environment and your particular body. I like to see that being explored in a little bit more detail.
Well, there was go ahead.
No, go on, Sean.
I was going to say there's a lot of topics in there for sure. Just one comment on the CCK. I looked at a study a while ago looking at CCK and appetite suppression, and it seemed to show that men seem to be affected more so than women and children for whatever reason. I don't know why that is. I mean, one study could maybe it wasn't repeatable. I thought that was kind of an interesting thing, but lots of things. The myostatin, no, I don't think bodybuilders are affected by. I mean, those guys are strong. I mean, they're not weak. I guarantee that they're very strong. They might not be as strong as pound for pound as an Olympic lifter or a power lifter, but they are very, very strong people. And I did not realize that the Belgian Blues and then the certified Piedmontese, which is a very similar animal, the same thing with a myostatin deficiency, have that same sort of muscled look, which makes for a very tender meat, even though it's lean. So it's kind of a nice option for that. But this is, so I guess the question I would have is obviously you've got this wealth of physiology knowledge and background and all the hormones and then drug development. And so now, as someone who's as you see within this community, most people here are sort of giving up drugs. I mean, they're getting off the medications, which I think is obviously probably not in Pfizer's best interest, I would say. I mean, call me somewhat skeptical, but I understand that the reason they exist is to produce drugs that people will take. And so when you have a community or something that says, okay, I no longer need to be on these expensive immune modulating drugs, which, as you are probably aware, are very, very, very expensive right now, and they're very popular. Like Humira, I think, is the #1 drug in the world right now, and I can't remember who makes that, but I think they're from a finances. I think they're $20 billion a year drug right now, which I think may be the most. Maybe I'm mistaken on that, but
yeah. So Humira has made $40 billion over since it's launched. It's the biggest selling drug in the history of medicines, and it's a TNF alpha blocker. So super interesting, and the conflict is the chairman of my current company. So I run a small biotech company at the moment called Leviset, which is developing a novel molecule for the treatment of osteoarthritis. And we've just completed our phase 1 study in patients. And the patients that we recruited, the comorbidities, so a person with osteoarthritis, the comorbidities are crazy. They range from being heavily overweight. We were recruiting people with BMIs less than 40. They had high blood pressure, often controlled diabetes, of course, often having depression. And for these patients, it's an endless cycle. They need something. The doctor will say, "Oh, you need to exercise." They can't exercise; they're in pain. They can't even get out, put their socks on. So having something that can relieve the pain may indeed address some of the other comorbidities. However, this is where the carnivore diet comes in, is that maybe they just need to change their diet. And that's a little freaky for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the point, because you look at, I mean, just say diabetes, for instance, something like 50% of diabetics are suffering from arthritis, 60% have hypertension, 80% are talking about type 2, 80% are overweight. I mean, they just run together, and there's this sort of, you've got to think, hey, there's got to be a common mechanism of action behind all of this stuff, or at least a few. And, one of the things we see with drugs is there's a very discrete target, very discrete endpoint. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, there's obviously going, let's just say we go to this SGLT2 inhibitor. We know what the endpoint we're looking at. We know what we're treating, but we have to think there are other GLUT2 transporters throughout the body. When we block them, what is a positive? What is a negative? What do we don't even know? I mean, these drugs may have interactions on other molecules besides just that transporter. And so, I mean, it's kind of like, you don't know what you're introducing system-wide. I don't think you can even test it. Is it feasible? Is it realistic to say that you can't test every single interaction that those drugs are going to have on the body? I mean, just like diet. I mean, it's just really hard to do.
Yeah, so the SGLT2 is an interesting story. So we came up with the idea in Sandwich to say, okay, how can we get people to lose weight? And we thought, glucose neogenesis is a key way, or lipolysis is a key way to get people to lose weight. So how can you get rid of glucose within the body, and you can drive weight loss that way? Your point with regards to SGLT2, there's two. So it's a sodium glucose transporter that's found within the intestine, as well as in the kidney. Its role in the intestine, it's SGLT1 in the intestine. It is the absorption of glucose, basically, through across the intestinal wall. The SGLT2 is predominantly found in the kidney. And its role is the reabsorption of glucose. So your kidney gets rid of glucose, sticks it into the outside the kidney, and then SGLT2 reabsorbs it back into the body. So in theory, you should not have any glucose in your urine. The molecule that was being progressed by Pfizer, and I think there's a couple of competitors there as well, it actually came from the substrate from apple bark, root bark, I think, and it's been profiled. This is why it takes so long. It costs so much money for a new molecule to reach the clinic, because they fully understand pharmacology and safety, and they understand how it binds to certain molecules. And of course, the SGLT2 at a certain dose will inhibit both SGLT1 and SGLT2, but I don't know the full multiples of that dose in order to do that. One interesting thing, and I didn't know, and I quickly looked up about SGLT2, is that it not only stops the reabsorption of glucose, but by doing that, you're driving lipolysis and gluconeogenesis, the production of glucose, because what's happening is you're basically peeing your glucose out by inhibiting the reabsorption of it, and you're causing lipolysis, so you're getting weight loss to some extent, but you're also getting increases in food intake, because the people still have insulin resistance. And then that's a key point, that you're not addressing the original pathology, you're just masking the pathology, I mean, so you're not addressing it. So significant diet changes are needed. But if you regulate someone's food intake so they're not taking too much glucose on, and have an SGLT2 inhibitor, you're excreting glucose, you're causing lipolysis and gluconeogenesis to the point that you're driving the patient into ketosis. And ketone bodies start to elevate in some people with SGLT2 inhibitors. So that's interesting for me, because my family have been on a ketone diet for a long time, for a few years now. And we naturally just switched over to carnivore. But what happened is that I noticed that my weight on the ketone diet increased. And I think it's because, and you've mentioned this, Shawn, previously, you still have sweeteners and stuff, you still have sort of additives, you still have like almond flour and all that sort of nonsense, and you try to muck it up a bit. You know, you're not real. And then when you go, and I think that's what could happen with the SGLT2, it's masking a lot of the complications with regards to diabetes. But personally, I think moving to a carnivore diet is super interesting, because your only option is meat. It's so easy. You only eat meat. There's no other options. But your brain, I've only been doing this for 45 days. Your brain changes, and you're not interested in anything else but meat. I've got a daughter who's 15, who's probably 90% carnivore, and she's getting the same. We don't have any sweets. I have no cravings for sweets. I've noticed that my brain is acting more clearly. My daughters who are in the UK at university, they've noticed my eyes, for example, are bright blue for the first time in many years. And then with regards to exercise, I used to do a lot of exercise with regards to riding a bike. I can get up in the mornings here and ride my bike for 100 miles. It'll take me 5.5 hours. So I'm going pretty quick. I don't have to eat anything. I'm fasted for the whole time. I'm just having electrolytes, and I have no shift in my glucose. So the carnivore diet just sorts so many things out. And I think with more interesting, particularly with regards to exercise physiology, with regards to the carnivore diet, would be of interest. And you've discussed this previously, Shawn, and some of your or your heart rate. Being a physiologist, I collect data and I just love it. But what I've noticed is that my resting heart rate is decreased since the carnivore diet by about 5 beats per minute. My heart rate variability has improved. So the difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic tone is more balanced. I can cycle for endlessly without feeling hungry. So my friends who are on carbohydrate diets are constantly having gels in order to maintain their glucose levels, where I'm just cycling with nothing but water, basically. My maximum heart rate has increased. It was 172. I can get it to 190 without feeling pain. I thought your heart rate was supposed to drop as you get older. And again, you've mentioned this, Shawn, it's increasing. And then I've got a complete lack of interest in anything but meat. It's really odd. I'm starting to watch, this is how it's affected my brain. I'm starting to watch videos with regards to meat. I watch YouTubes with regard to how to cook meat. I bought myself a smoker. I smoke meat all the time now. We bought a mincer. We mince meat. The dogs are on full carnivore now. We make homemade dog food. My wife just recently bought a meat slicer so we can make our own bacon. So we brine our bacon and cook it. We're making prosciutto. We had to go and buy a new fridge for the meat, for all the different ways we brining and keeping our meat. And it's the easiest and fun way to eat. Now, I think the only restriction is when you're out. You've got to sort of think a bit. But it's really changed the way I've been thinking, both professionally as well as personally.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the thing, you've obviously got a lot of experience with research, and you said you used to write a bunch of, grant proposals. And what I've seen, I remember watching a video on, some researchers looking at a ketogenic diet and saying, look at these mice, look at all the wonderful things that happen. If there's no one that's going to do the diet, and therefore we've got to be able to figure out how to make a pill that does this diet. I wonder if we'll see some similar sort of thing if you figure out the physiology of what's going on, either centrally in the brain, in the hypothalamus, or wherever this is causing interactions versus the gut, and then can we replicate that with a pill? I mean, I'm certainly, I would say, like I said, if we look at the results we're getting in some of these cases, and again, this is still to be determined, we need to do the studies to verify this, but if we just assume that, hey, these people are actually getting good results, this is $1 billion drug, effect wise, right? But how do you monetize that? And, these people are going to be scratching their head. How do we can't just put, capsules of beef in a tablet and say, hey, look at this, take this magic pill. That's not how it works. So
yeah.
where do you think there is a, pharmaceutical angle on the physiology that's occurring if we figure this out?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this with great detail. I want there to be one. I'm thinking about looking at mitochondrial efficiencies and trying to improve mitochondrial handling. I think that's a key area of research, both not necessarily for obesity or metabolic health, but for longevity and human health. But that's hard. It's quite hard to manipulate the mitochondria. But I think if you're a diabetic, long-term diabetic, and on multiple drugs, by having one magic pill that modulates the mitochondria is not going to work. I think a mitochondrial manipulator, or whatever I'm going to call it, would probably be beneficial maybe for someone who's not chronic diabetic or just healthy, but then you've got the complexity of trying to balance the ketones and the glucose. So if you've got excessive amounts of glucose in your diet, you're never going to be able to have that. Your body's not going to fight or try to regulate those excessive ketones. It's one or the other. And so to manipulate that by a drug, I think it's going to be impossible.
Yeah, I suspect the same, and it's, and here's what I would propose. I mean, and I'll freely admit this. If I could take a pill and I could eat cheesecake and ice cream and be as healthy as possible, I would do that. I mean, if it works. But, I had this discussion with my daughter. She said, Daddy, I wish sugar was healthy for you. I said, I do too, sweetheart. Because it's, it's just hedonistic, and you just, you just kind of love it. But the reality is it's not. And so you've got to figure out, and it's not that when I'm, I forgot to, but I need to go throw my ribeyes in the sous vide here in a little bit, but those are going to be delicious. I'm going to enjoy those in a very, I don't know if I want to call, I will call it hedonistic manner. It's going to be luxurious. I'm going to enjoy it. So at least I have it. It's just that, you have to trade one for the other. And the nice thing about this is that you do get, like you're saying, you sit there, and I've done the same thing where you just sit there and watch these videos, these really accomplished chefs or barbecue guys cooking these just ridiculously good looking cuts of meat, and you're just salivating and drooling and dreaming about this stuff. You have these dreams about this stuff.
It's odd. It's, for me personally, it's odd behavior. I was thinking, why am I watching videos about people cooking a brisket? It's just like, what am I doing? It's really changed my thinking. And I have no interest whatsoever about any baking. For example, we were watching a cooking show in America, I think it's Chef's Table or something like that, and they were baking. And my wife, who's on the carnivore diet as well, and in the group, said we looked at each other and said, "What are we watching? This is boring." Yeah, so we just turned it off, and I think we watched something about smoking some brisket. But it's really, really changed the way I've been thinking. And again, I've got some bone marrow on the smoker now, and we're going to have some ribeye for tea. And I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, and the bone marrow is delicious as well. And so, yeah, like if you put the bone marrow, and some people use it as a butter on top of their ribeyes, which is particularly good if you have the opportunity to do that. So do you find that, I mean, as you've been doing this 45 days, you've been I've seen you in the community fairly regularly. So you see this and I mean, clearly, I mean, this is the thing. There's obviously a lot of skeptics, a lot of critics out there. There's a lot of people saying, well, you guys are zealots. And I try to sort of say we're kind of do what works for us. But as you sort of see the obvious, you see people in here with their testimonials and you see all the stuff that we've been just collecting the data. Is there a conflict of interest in what you do for a living versus what you're seeing going on with this stuff? I mean, how do you make those two work?
So, unfortunately, I don't think the significant amount of people in the world are going to go onto a carnivore diet. Yeah, I know this group would want everyone to go on a carnivore diet, because some of the testimonies I've heard from this group, there was a woman who you spoke to about maybe 3 weeks ago who was bedbound, and now she's walking and running. I just that is just unbelievable. Like she was bedbound, she couldn't get out of bed. She had, I think she has got some. It's some mutation. I can't remember what it was, or something's wrong. Obviously, what was wrong with her, and she's obviously still got it. But she's not only walking, she's running and not in pain anymore. And there's a number of examples of that, Shawn. And indeed, I think food is the medicine. Yeah, we know that. We've been taught food is the medicine. But unfortunately, the Western world, and also places like India and China, have a Western diet, and food in their case is not the medicine; it's the devil. But educating people in regards to just eat meat, that's hard to do.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I've been I've been at this for several years now, and I've been vilified and demonized and called every name in the book. And, at the same time, every day I get people saying, hey, I can't thank you enough for changing my life. So it's hard to, just to kind of ignore the people that say they've gotten better, even though, it's like, and we are, as we're trying to push for some trials and trying to get that funded and that type of stuff. And I was going to ask, because you probably have a lot of experience with CROs. I mean, these are the ones that generally run the drug trials for the pharmaceutical companies, because they're, that's what they do, and they're very efficient at it. And we may end up actually utilizing one of those as we look into that, to seeing the best way to get this done in an efficient way. Now, that tends to be a little more expensive that way, but that's, we definitely want to get it done. So, do you have any, when you let's just say this, you mentioned this Band-Aid with SGLT2 inhibitors, and, and I see the same thing. I mean, it seems like for maybe someone initially, it could be a very effective drug. And there's a lot of people that laud these drugs. They are, they're becoming used more widely. Outside of the side effects of, fungal infections of the genital tract and those type of things, which tend to be inconvenient if you get one, but they're hopefully fairly rare. But and I see the same thing with ketogenic diets to some degree. You're just basically wasting energy. I mean, you're peeing off all this glucose, which would otherwise be energy. With a ketogenic diet, particularly in the beginning, when you're wasting all these ketones, it's the same effect. I mean, you're just pissing off energy, breathing it off, or however you want to say it. I mean, that's what's initially going on, and then it stabilizes. And I wonder, I guess one of the, obviously it's going to depend on the patient. Somebody's got a lot of weight to lose. That's probably reasonable. I'm curious as to the mechanism of why it's driving gluconeogenesis. I'm not sure I follow the physiology on that, or even the lipolysis. I mean, based on what its mechanism of action is, why would it be doing those other two things?
So that's just maintaining glucohomeostasis. So you're excreting glucose, yeah. So you're changing your glucagon and insulin balance to supplement the loss of glucose. So that's got to come from somewhere. Unless you're increasing your food intake, which often they're doing, you're going to be driving lipolysis to meet your glucose demands because you're excreting it via the kidney.
I see. So it's just an attempt to maintain, to not go hypoglycemic. But my understanding is, that's largely first driven by glucagon when we get, a little bit low. And then if we get extremely low or we're symptomatic, then we're releasing the counter cortisol, norepinephrine. And then again, I guess, if it's a fight or flight thing, if you're in a fight or exercising real hard, you're tapping into that cortisol response to drive gluconeogenesis, or even glycogenolysis, which would be the more acute thing. I think gluconeogenesis is a relatively slow process, versus glycogenolysis, which can, restore your blood glucose quite quickly. So that makes sense. I thought the drug itself was driving it. It's just a compensatory mechanism. I got it.
Yeah. You get an up increase in hepatic glucose output, and then you also get free fatty acids start to pour in and increase in ketosis in ketones. So you're driving your gluconeogenesis via that pathway. So there's a conflict between the two metabolic pathways, the ketone pathway and also the glucose pathway, which is interestingly for people who are metabolically unstable. Then I don't think they're going to use who can't utilize either of those pathways.
Yeah, that's a precarious and difficult situation because I think there's some calculation that they're looking at total energy in the blood, whether it's free fatty acids or glucose or ketones or even some lactate, it's being reshuffled from glucose utilization, but that tends to maintain a balance. And then sometimes if your fat goes up, your glucose may go down. I think we see that a lot in the low carb community where people see these really low blood glucoses, but they're at the same time they're transiting more fat in the blood, and they may see elevations in things like cholesterol and free fatty acids in the blood, particularly postprandially when you see those triglycerides come up. But then you have some people that have difficulty using either fuel, which is challenging because I think this is where we see these people that have been long-term, pretty much maybe brittle diabetics where they're desperately tied to high glucose levels to run their cellular machinery. And then you tell them to switch over to fat-based metabolism and their body just can't make the switch. And then what they're seeing is their glucose is dropping. They can't quite use the ketones or the fatty acids well. And then they're in this sort of, I feel miserable, I'm tired type of situation. And I think we see those people, and I think it's one of those, how do you get them to make that switch? And sometimes it takes more aggressive type of things. And I've heard people talking about, like Nadir Ali talking about fasting and that stuff, but it's a challenge. So you said you're working on an osteoarthritis drug right now. Is that right?
Yes. So I left Sandwich, and I started up my own company, went to venture capitalists and try to raise money for an idea, no more than an idea at the time, of how to have an analgesic for osteoarthritis. And we've taken that molecule from an idea all the way to end of phase 1. We're just completing Series B financing to support a phase 2 trial. We run the company virtually. We employ 1.2 people, and that sounds crazy to run a biotech on 1.2. But we outsource all our work to the very best people we possibly can. And the molecule has finished phase 1. It looks safe, does what it should do on the tin, and hopefully we'll start the phase 2 study in 400 osteoarthritis patients in Europe and America, COVID depending. Sometime next year.
That's fascinating. And as you're probably aware, we see a lot of people whose osteoarthritis just gets better on this diet. And I don't know if it's I saw a paper recently come out, I think it was last year, looking at fibroblast-like synoviocytes. And, we see when insulin was downregulated, they stopped producing inflammatory cytokines, or at least that was, that was decreased. And we saw less acceleration of the, eventual arthritic process. And I don't know if, again, it seems like insulin has its finger in everything a little bit to some degree.
But it's a combination of reducing inflammation is key. So I believe osteoarthritis is a neuroinflammation disease. So it's not like RA, but it's different. So it's pain receptors being triggered by inflammation within the joints, and is driven by not only injury, but obviously diet's playing a significant role. And then switching to a diet like this, you'll have weight loss as well as a non-inflamed state. So it's only going to be beneficial.
Yeah, and as an orthopedic surgeon, I mean, my classic training, for osteoarthritis, now we would always draw the line between inflammatory arthropathies, rheumatoid, psoriatic, and many of the others that are there. But osteoarthritis was always this concept of wear and tear, and it's obesity associated, and I think that's a natural assumption to make. But when you start to look in the biology, we find that the obesity is associated with an inflammatory state. I started seeing people dramatically improve their osteoarthritis with minimal to no weight loss, which I thought was very curious to me, because I had always been taught that the knee carries 6 times the amount of mechanical load through the joint over your body weight, and if you lose 1 pound, you're taking 6 pounds off your knee, and yada yada yada. And there may be and there is truth to that, but I mean, at the same time, I think we kind of got it wrong, and osteoarthritis is in many cases an inflammatory. It's not to say that the mechanics have no role, because clearly they do, but I think we missed the boat with by completely ignoring the biologic and the dietary role.
It's a balancing act of repair and degradation. So the bone's constantly repairing itself. So if you've got a shift in that balance due to inflamed state, you're never going to be able to repair the joint adequately. You get OA. So it's a shift in that balance. And you think of all the mesenchymal stem cells that are located within that bone marrow, probably all being suppressed to some extent, and they're there to fight inflammation and not there to repair. Absolutely.
Well, Simon, this has been an hour. It's been fascinating. You get your wealth of knowledge and physiology, and I truly enjoy physiology. Even though I ended up being a stupid guy that swung a hammer and chiseled on bones, my absolute favorite part of medical school was physiology. I excelled in physiology. I love physiology, but it was one of my favorite subjects, and probably, I guess I could have easily gone into endocrinology, but it wasn't cool enough,
It's a pity they didn't teach you anything about nutrition, though, eh?
Well, yeah, it's just a funding source of the medical education. I mean, we're not really interested in that. It doesn't really it doesn't pay the light bill. So, all right, guys, thank you so much. We'll see you back tomorrow. I don't know if we have somebody special, a new guest tomorrow. I think we might. I can't remember, but anyway, you guys have a great week, and we will talk to everyone later. Thank you again, Simon. Say hi to your wife.
No worries. Thank you all.
Appreciate you being part of the community. Take care now. Bye-bye.